Hey everyone, I'm your host Cadence, and welcome back to another episode of Project Honesty. This is a podcast by a young adult for young adults to acquire unfiltered advice and bold opinions, as well as take deep dives into the issues shaping our world. We'll challenge ideas, explore new perspectives, and have fun while navigating the ups and downs of life. This is Project Honesty, where truth meets curiosity and every conversation matters. Today's topic, in light of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, is about Truth and Reconciliation Day. It might seem a little short. I didn't intend it to be short, but we're going to talk about why it's important, the significance of today, as well as ways that I, as someone who is non-Indigenous, participates or at least attempts to commit and participate to reconciliation and reconciliation. And I think I've talked about the difference between the two before, but if not, I'll dive deeper into that today. So why is having National Truth and Reconciliation Day so important? And what does it recognize? So National Truth and Reconciliation Day is important because it acknowledges the historical and ongoing injustices, and we'll get to that in a bit, faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada, especially considering the trauma caused by the residential school system, which was a kind of a partnership between the federal government of Canada and the Catholic Church to assimilate and erase Indigenous people as a whole. And the day is mainly about remembering, learning, and committing to change. So some of the reasons, and there's 4 listed here, about why specifically this is important, is so it honors the survivors and the victims. So it gives space to honor the survivors of residential schools, which they still exist. If you didn't know already, we are all living amongst residential school survivors and their families, and it also gives space to honor the children who never came home. I don't know when it was. I think it was in 2021, I want to say. I feel like I'm wrong. I don't actually remember. But recently, within the last 10 years, we've started finding more and more grave sites of Indigenous, or I guess how it's outlined in most texts, of Indian residential schools, and the children that didn't survive the abuse in those, I say with air quotes, schools. They were not schools. And another aspect of Truth and Reconciliation Day is raising public awareness. So it ensures that more Canadians, not all, but more Canadians understand the truth about our colonial history, including how policies like the residential school and the Indian Act were all tools of cultural genocide. Genocide and assimilation when it comes to Indigenous communities in Canada is something that I think people try to stray away from labeling it as a genocide, but that's exactly what it was. It was the Canadian federal government and the Catholic Church trying to erase the history of a people. And I mean, that's not the exact definition of genocide, but it's pretty damn close. This day also supports the healing, the ongoing healing, and justice seeking. So acknowledging the past harms is a critical part of healing for Indigenous communities and a step towards rebuilding trust and ensuring justice is had. And kind of like bouncing off of that, this day kind of directly responds to some of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or the TRC, as you'll hear me refer to it throughout this episode, which I've actually linked all of the calls to action. There's 94, I think 94 or 90. No, there's 94, which urged the federal government to establish a statutory holiday to commemorate the legacy of residential schools. Now, I say this, and Indigenous people know this, non-Indigenous people should know this, is that the government has not even halved the calls in the list that the TRC has laid out. I think out of 94, they have fulfilled 15. This call to action list from the TRC has existed for a really long time, and the government has had plenty of time to fulfill these calls, yet have not. And some of these calls are as basic as water on reserves, proper education for Indigenous children living on reserve, more mental health support for Indigenous people and communities as an individual and also collective. So the government has a lot to do when it comes to that, and so I would like to think that this day is a reminder to them that the TRC's call to actions do exist and should be fulfilled. This day recognizes the TRC's findings into residential schools, which documented the abuse, neglect, and intergenerational trauma caused by these schools. The TRC has done an incredible amount of research, and that is also what has influenced some of the things that are on that list, which again, linked below. They are very, very detailed in their evidence around the effect of intergenerational trauma in a contemporary perspective, as well as just the overall trauma that residential schools caused and continue to cause. It also highlights the resilience of Indigenous communities and the importance of cultural preservation and revitalization, and the need for active reconciliation, or as most people like to say, reconciliation. So not just symbolic gestures, which is, say, wearing an orange shirt, which we'll talk about in just a second, but it includes educating non-Indigenous people, so educating yourself, supporting Indigenous voices, and addressing the systematic inequalities that still persist today that actively work against Indigenous communities. I quickly want to talk about the symbol of orange shirts and the color orange in Orange Shirt Day, because that is also another thing that this day is called is Orange Shirt Day, and it's inspired by Phyllis Webstad, who is a residential school survivor. As a child, her orange shirt was taken from her on her first day of school, and it's a symbol of loss, identity, and resilience. So wearing orange shows full support and recognition, but I encourage, again, on the education part of this conversation, I've linked Phyllis Webstad's full story in the description below. I'm not going to name the links, but you can find it. I think it's like Phyllis Webstad. It's like a PDF, I'm pretty sure. And I remember reading her story and listening to her story, and she's been on a couple, not podcasts, but like interviews, I should say. And her story is really inspiring and perspective changing is what I would say. And it further helps us understand the impact of residential schools and what they have on mental health of Indigenous communities now. Okay, now I want to talk about what does reconciliation or reconciliation look like, specifically for someone like me who is non-Indigenous. Now, there are many ways. There's the classic, you could donate, education, listening, attending things, but I wanted to talk about the way that I choose to participate in reconciliation. And that is by reading books from Indigenous authors. And I want to talk about two here today, Bob Joseph and Robin Wall Kimmerer. So first, I want to talk about Bob Joseph. He is a part of the Gawawa Inuk Nation that is in the unceded territory of British Columbia, Canada. He's the founder and president of Indigenous Corporate Training Incorporated, and Bob's book explores colonization in Canadian legislation and analyzes the contemporary problems this legislation causes for Indigenous communities. With his best-selling book that some of you may have heard, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about this on here before, is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, and his new book that I have bought, that I have not yet had the chance to read, is 21 Things You May Not Know About Indigenous Self-Government. A lot of his books are exploring how policies and legislation created way back when, like the Indian Act, still impose assimilation into contemporary Indigenous communities that further impact the healing process of generational trauma. I've talked about the trickle-down effect of intergenerational trauma before, and how it's not just like going to therapy. It's not as simple as that. Indigenous communities have had their culture simply ripped away from them for years. And trying to reconnect with that is a process bigger than we know, but it's not impossible to understand. And I think reading his book as a non-Indigenous person puts into perspective the level of inhumanity and assimilation that has impacted Indigenous communities, especially in his 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. The Indian Act wasn't designed to be easy to follow, easy to read, easy to understand. And I've talked about this before. It makes understanding this intentionally confusing piece of legislation easier to understand, as well as going further to outline how empathy and compassion are crucial parts of being fully committed to reconciliation and reconciliation. I will take pictures of like the titles of these, or like the covers of these books, and I'm going to post them on the Instagram at some point today. But yeah, I think his books, because I, in school, have taken Indigenous studies all the way up into the 30 level, which if you're in Alberta, that just means the top level course you can get in grade 12. And I remember trying to learn about the Indian Act, and I had to pull up sections of it, and I was so damn confused. It is not meant for you to understand it, okay? It is meant to be told to you and you to just agree with it. That is how it has assimilated so many Indigenous communities and cultures in this country. And so that was easier because he dissects it, like point by point dissects what the Indian Act is and how it is impacting Indigenous communities today. Now I want to talk about Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is a Potawatomi botanist, author, and the director of the Center for Native People and the Environment at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Robin is a scientist, and her books consist of incorporating Indigenous plant knowledge and care with Western botany practices. A lot of her books analyze the link between botanical practices and Indigenous caretaking of the land. Her bestseller, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is my favorite book. I am trying to read it for the second time, but I remember reading it for the first time, and it was so good. And there's actually a story in there. It's the very first chapter, called Sky Woman, and that story is so beautiful. It talks about the creation of Turtle Island, how interconnected we all are through nature, and how we have to help each other out. It's a really, really beautiful story. I'll try to actually link that down below if I can find a copy of it. But Braiding Sweetgrass discusses how using plants as medicines is foundationalized in Indigenous teachings. Being a scientist, she talks a lot about medicinal plant use, and I've noticed it more in the book Gathering Mosses or something. I also have that one. She is very much focused on the fact that medicinal use of plants is a very Indigenous way of knowing and creating. And again, in Braiding Sweetgrass, she also discusses climate change, and her career is, I think she's a professor of botany, and how she uses her knowledge as an Indigenous person to challenge her students to create new perspectives on botany and climate change. That is also in the very first chapter, I'm pretty sure, or second, third, I'm not too sure. And so those two authors are ways that I try and attempt and commit to reconciliation, is by learning from them, and from their teachings and their ways of knowing. There's also a book that I have yet to get, but I really want to get it. It's called 52 Ways to Reconcile. I don't know the author, but that is a top-rated book for people seeking to read more Indigenous literature and to further understand the impact of assimilation on Indigenous communities. So my book recommendations from what I've read or started reading is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, Braiding Sweetgrass, Gathering Moss, and the Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And again, I'll share pictures of these on the Instagram page. And other ways of committing or educating yourself on reconciliation is reading the TRC's Commission's calls to action. I've linked those down below. Yes, it is a long document. There is 94 of them, but there is a reason there is 94 of them. I promise. Dedicate, how long did it take me? Like half an hour. Just read the points and see how much the Canadian government still has to do in order to be a full active participant in reconciliation. Following Indigenous creators, listening and sharing and reading their stories. And one other point that I put in here is sharing the importance of finding your own method of truth and reconciliation, because it's not the same for everybody. Reading is not everyone's forte, which is fine, but it's about actively seeking out ways to commit to reconciliation on your own terms and incorporate it into your daily life. Now, something I just added in here before I decided to stop writing this episode was I wanted to read 2 Indigenous poems. They're both by Indigenous women, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And they're really beautiful ways to tell tragic stories, is the way that I'm going to put that. So the first one is called I Lost My Talk by Mi'kmaq writer and songwriter Rita Joe. So I lost my talk. I lost my talk, the talk you took away, when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School. You snatched it away. I speak like you, I think like you, I create like you. The scrambled ballad about my word. 2 ways I talk, both ways I say. Your way is more powerful. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk, so I can teach you about me. This poem highlights the importance of language diversity of Indigenous communities and how language is a vital tool in understanding Indigenous culture and people who are Indigenous and the stories their language holds. Many Indigenous people being assimilated in residential schools were forced and abused into forgetting their languages in order to please the white man and the Catholic Church that facilitated the majority of these schools. And so knowing and understanding the importance of language is why I chose that poem. Rita Joe, I haven't read any of her other poems, but I thought that one was really beautiful. I did link a website from the Poetry Lab that links both poems I read on here today, plus 3 other ones that are important to check out. So this next one almost made me cry when I read it for the first time. It's called This Woman, Nookum by Jay Simpson, who's an Ojibwe writer, and this one is a little bit longer, but it's so beautiful. This Woman, Nookum by Jay Simpson. How do I explain my queerness to the gatekeeper of my bloodline when she flushed hers out with communion wine and holy water? How do I explain my ever-shifting body to the woman who prayed for damnation for me rather than my absolution? My grandmother who held me at birth has prayed for my end more than my success. She'd done this many times over, begging God that we'd be better off dead, burying 2 spirit cousins after 2 spirit cousin, hanging their queer bodies like a slaughtered coyote on a post as to say, do not come around here no more. This woman does not see the 2 spirit as hallowed or sacred, but sees me as crawling out of the mud like a demon to bring forth the end to the world like the 4-headed beast of Revelations. This woman cut down the family tree to build the church where our funerals would be. This woman salted the fields where we were meant to grow. This woman has never loved a day in her life. This woman begged for residential school, etched colonization into her bones, cracked into marrow to write passages out of the Bible in her right hand in white blood cell matter. This woman broke the Bible on my mother's back, bruised and branded Old Testament into the flesh of my mother, trying to exorcise intergenerational trauma as if it was some demon. But holy water does not wine make, yet the gatekeeper of my bloodline flushed hers with communion wine and holy water. This woman buried my mother in the colonizer's church, cut my hair the night before, and told me to say my prayers or I'd end up in hell with my mother. Told me to be a, quote, good Indian and not cry. I would rather outlive her now than explain my queerness, knowing how she'd cast me out, strike my back raw, rip my claim from my mother tongue, flay me in the front of the land that birthed our people. This woman cut down the family tree to build a church where our funerals would be. This woman would rather an empty church and a graveyard full of her children than actually know who we are. This poem is so incredibly powerful, and that is why I chose it. This poem is indirectly about residential schools and explores the direct impact of colonist policies and white supremacy that was apparent and still is apparent and imposed on Indigenous communities, and how through education, white supremacy and colonization can be taught, as well as shows us that it can be untaught. So yeah, I'm kind of at a loss for words at that. That was a beautiful piece of poetry, and when I read it, I almost cried. Like, for the first time, I almost cried. Jay Simpson is an amazing writer. So I recommend checking the links in the description below for more insight. And thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can check us out on social media. Our Instagram is project_honesty24. Our TikTok is project.honesty. Our website is linked in our Instagram bio, and we are available for listening on Spotify and YouTube. If you enjoy listening to Project Honesty, share us with friends and family, and you can direct them to the Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, website, or TikTok to help them learn more. Subscribe, follow, and click the bell icon for updates when I post, and remember, the more listeners, the bigger the family.